energy, economy, finance, transport. I didn't mention that most of the advances in those sectors actually came from the next speaker that we have today in the session, which is Stephen Popper. Stephen has a PhD in economics, University of California, Berkeley, and is a RAND Senior Economist, who is one of the developers of several model-based and qualitative methods for decision-making under deep uncertainties. He has led teams that developed the DMDU framework, so decision-making under deep uncertainty, and applications of that and analysis for the US and the foreign governments, as well as different NGOs in planning strategies for energy, transportation, water management, science and technology policy, economic development, etc. Stephen served as Associate Director of the Science and Technology Policy Institute, which provided research and analytical support to the White House, Office of Science and Technology Policies, and other agencies. He's the co-editor of Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty from Theory to Practice, the first handbook on DMDU methods. So definitely a person that has a lot to say on DMDU, and maybe also give us some inspiration about the use of the framework and management of a marine ecosystem at such large scale like the Atlantic Ocean. Thank you, Stephen, and please share your screen. And
thank you, Patrizio. Let me see. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, which is actually a personal pleasure, because at one point I considered a career in ocean science. So this is really lots of fun. The more I thought about this, I kind of changed the nature of the talk, less of sort of an overview of DMDU, and really, you know, if we're talking about management, this really goes beyond science. It's science talking to policy, policy talking to science. I was able to listen to Mary and Geert's presentations. Clearly, the people on this call are well aware of it. So I'm going to make that kind of the focus of what I'm going to talk about. So what we really have is the makings of a wicked problem. Yes, when we think about decision-making under uncertainty, the first bullet comes through. There are fundamental uncertainties, lack of data, lack of the ability to you know, gain the information, perform the experiments that we would want. But that's really just the beginning of it. There's really a problem with how can we more effectively use the expertise that scientists possess after years, after decades of working. They're professionally limited into what they can say, you know, forcefully to policy, because the very nature of deep uncertainty means it's difficult to do the, you know, the dispositive experiment, do the definitive analysis, and yet policymakers ask for concrete forecasts. Another problem is that there's been kind of two processes of diffusion in the policy space. One is kind of a diffusion of authoritative expertise, which is to say that there are many more centers of knowledge and centers that can coalesce into groups of interest. So there are many more seats at the table than there have been previously. And the second is that, you know, the problems that we're talking about are not easily disposed of by one government ministry or one department. They are problems of transportation and education and health and economic development and so on. And so it's not just a question of deep uncertainty and resolving deep uncertainty. We have a problem at the fundamental paradigms that we use to reason through public policy are kind of rooted in what I will talk about in a little bit, sort of a predictive aspect that we're going to forecast, we're going to optimize, and then, you know, introduce policies that will solve the problem that we seek to address. If the problem is one of science talking to policy and policy talking to science, we really have to recognize that we have something of a two cultures problem. People who come out of the analytical culture, the science community, they're numerate. They use reductive reasoning. They're systematic in their approaches, and fundamentally, applying deductive logics. Whereas in the policy culture, it's more of a narrative-based culture. It focuses on details. It focuses on distinctions, and ultimately, it's rooted in kind of an inductive logic. What if we do this? What if this happens? What if they do that? And so, there's really a fundamental issue of trying to lower the mismatch, make it easier for analysts to develop product and output that will feed directly into the policymaking process, rather than necessarily just, a scientific paper that the policy planners and so on would need to, kind of infer what the importance is. So what we're really talking here about is the problem of assumptions. All plans, all management plans make assumptions. Many are defined explicitly, but most plans contain hidden assumptions, and these are the things that really can cause significant problems. We make these assumptions because we don't know for sure. It's uncertainty that does this. And this uncertainty is not because we haven't done our homework. It's really inherent in the sort of questions that we're trying to address. So, the core of DMDU thinking is that, in the presence of uncertainty, deal systematically with both of these kinds of assumptions, explicit and implicit, and make them formally part of the planning process. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but if to the extent that we are reliant on forecasts, there are a whole series of pathologies that arise, and particularly contention over assumptions. People are not stupid. They understand that the assumptions you make at the beginning will determine what conclusions you arrive at. And so you will have an endless discussion about which currently unknowable facts are actually the true representation of reality. Again, the essence of DMDU is to not force that early choice, and instead to see what implications different assumptions might have for the types of solutions that you might consider. So this is the fundamental point. We spend a lot of time on forecasts, predictions, and so on, but I would submit that's not really what we're interested in fundamentally. What we're interested in is trying to understand which of the alternative short-term decisions that we can make are going to be consistent with our interests across a wide range of plausible futures. So if we're going to do that, that really means that we have two broad categories of issues that we need to deal with. One is to deal with the consequences of what we have called deep uncertainty, which I'll define as when we don't know or cannot agree on values or probabilities of future values of important factors, or we do not know or cannot agree upon what is the true model. What are the actual causal relationships between inputs and outcomes? But there are also normative consequences as well that we need to deal with. How do we deal with competing explicit and implicit visions? And this is something that Gert was talking about quite a bit. How do we deal with the fact that we do have widely different assumptions and that we do have many more stakeholders that need to be represented? So there are many different, it's a very young field, some 30 years since a small group of us started thinking about this problem. But there are already a number of DMDU techniques. And I think it's fair to say that what really makes them different from more traditional analyses is captured on this slide. The more traditional analysis, what I'll characterize as predict then act, but basically the fundamentals of decision science are to build models, to gather data, to try and come up with as accurate a prediction as we can on what the future will be, and then consider what are the best near-term decisions optimizing for our goals and objectives, and then do some kind of sensitivity analysis around it. The difference between that and DMDU techniques is we assume that we cannot figure out which are the correct and incorrect assumptions, and therefore make sure everybody is along for the ride. Encompass the full range of assumptions and focus on the decision that we need to make. What are our choices? To what extent can we determine what the implications are of choosing one versus another? And most importantly, can we get better insight on the criteria upon which we should base our decisions if we want to achieve this goal of having our short-term decisions be consistent with long-term goals across a wide range of futures? In other words, to create a robust strategy. What this boils down to are a series of principles, not answering the question, what will happen, but more question of what would we need to believe was true? What assumptions are consistent with, course of action A and course of action B, and what are the criteria for selecting among them? So we reason over, large ensembles of cases, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million. We seek strategies that are not optimal because I think either Mary or Garrett, said the magic word that this is, these are multi-attribute problem spaces, and we care about things that move in opposite directions, such as sustainability and economic development, for example. We build adaptation into our policy response instead of the usual fiction of kind of fire and forget policies. We've now solved this problem. We can move on to the next problem. And critically, in an era, in a regime where it is very difficult to characterize uncertainties probabilistically, that too would require another assumption about probability density functions and so on, to instead characterize uncertainties in terms of their relevance to the decision. So this is very much focused on the end of the problem. What are the policymakers and the planners trying to do? And framing the entire analytical structure around that. I'm going to move very quickly through this. This is a quick overview of the robust decision-making method. It's characteristic of a number of DMDU methods, and it proceeds through various phases. First and all important is the decision framing, such as developing a vision. How can you talk about strategy? How can you talk about policy unless you have some kind of definition of what is good? What are we trying to achieve? What would success look like? Secondly, using a model or some other, formalism which I can talk about perhaps during Q&A, generate the database, where we're using the model not as a predictive engine, but as a way of generating cases that we can then examine. Remember, we're looking at how well a particular strategy does across a wide range of potential future conditions. So now we look to see where it might be vulnerable. And I think Mary spoke about scenario discovery. This is part of that step. So interestingly, instead of developing scenarios ex ante using an inductive logic approach where we're sort of guessing about what the main drivers are and the, et cetera, here the scenarios arise analytically from the analytical process itself. What is an important scenario? An important scenario is something that tells us very useful about the choices that we face. Then a trade-off analysis, which I'll illustrate in a moment, and arrive at something like a robust strategy. So, the output might look something like this. Because we're not trying to be predictive, the question is, how do we compare different strategies? And we use it by, using some measure of regret, where by definition, the strategy that would be best suited to whatever the future conditions actually turn out to be would be a zero regret strategy. So we can do something like this, where we can, discover what are actually in the wide range of uncertainties that exist. What are the crucial uncertainties that demonstrate the difference in behavior of these different plans? One might look like this, with rising regret at higher values. Another might look like this, with high regret at lower values of that variable. Some plans will be clearly dominated throughout the entire region by others, and some may emerge that a traditional technique might have discarded early on in the process because it's dominated by at least one other strategy in almost the full range of the factor of interest, but it has this very interesting property of failing gracefully throughout the whole region. So if we'd had no more information, all we had was this, and we really were interested in finding something that was going to be robust, this would suggest itself as a candidate. Another way to interpret something like this is, okay, now we know, again, all the uncertainties and so on. Now we know what uncertainty really seems to make a difference, and even what regions of values are important. Now we have a better sense of how we can concentrate and apply our limited resources for research. You can do the same thing, but instead of looking at some critical variable, you can use one of these stressful scenarios that emerge from the scenario discovery and run this as an expectation. How would we expect these to behave if the odds were 100 to 1, against this stressful scenario? And you can see throughout the region. So now you can, sort of introduce through the back end a sense of probabilities. I'm not going to brief the next two slides, but they're just intended to illustrate that you can also use qualitative techniques. This is a technique called assumption-based planning, where you try to figure out which are the key assumptions for a given plan, what might cause them to be vulnerable, what in the case of a broken assumption you might build into the plan in terms of hedging actions, what signals you might look for in order to be adaptive, and what kind of shaping actions would be necessary in order to try and shape the environment to be more conducive to the plan. We've used this and we've set it within the context of three horizon foresight. We've used this to great effect, and this can be used either this qualitative approach as being sufficient unto itself, or as the entry point for a more quantitative model-based approach. So in terms of the recommendations that we were asked to provide, when we really cannot speak probabilistically, shift from this, systemic approach to prediction to one of trying to analyze underlying assumptions. At the beginning, employ some kind of a structured qualitative process to define vision. When it's inappropriate to characterize uncertainties probabilistically, use them instead characterize them in terms of their influence over choices. Whatever you do, try to have an ongoing process, what the National Academy of Sciences in the United States calls deliberation with analysis, sort of an iterative cycle between the analysts and the stakeholders, working towards some shift in the course of the process where the policymakers are the ones who kind of take over the ownership. And use DMDU methods, initially with very simple models before expending a lot of resources. Take advantage of the inherent iterative nature of the process to figure out where, in fact, the marginal dollar that could be spent on detailed analysis, whether empirical or theoretical, could best be spent. It would be spent in those regions where we are trying to distinguish between the choices that we have before us. I know that was a bit of a whirlwind. Thank you for your patience, and I'm certainly happy to participate in the roundtable and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Stephen. You have opened up several fronts, I would say. One which is more like methods and techniques and statistical tools that we can employ in this type of analysis. Another one, I think, is more kind of philosophical. If I understood correctly, this moving from uncertainty on the assumptions into a focus on the uncertainty on decision. And I was trying to think how we can translate this into, for example, fish stock management, because maybe the kind of common objective for all the decision makers would be to keep the resource sustainable. But of course, how to share it will depend strongly on what are the assumptions about their distributions, for example, or their economic value across different countries. So I was trying to think how we can make that transition or translation of these methods into something more applied in fishery oceanography, for example. And
well, I'm smiling a little bit because I just completed the last term in our graduate school where Robert Lempert and I teach a course on decision-making, deep uncertainty, robust decision-making. We've taught it since the mid-90s. And one thing that is consistent in an ever-changing course is that one of the homework assignments we give the students is a fisheries model, based on Lot-Volterra, equations with, clear chaotic region. And the assignment is come up with a fishery management plan that is, going to balance yield against, the sustainment of the population. So there are many direct applications of this sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe I should take the graduate course at some point. Yeah, but thanks for now.